go. And once I get that up and going, I'm going to mute this one. Go. Yes. Otherwise, we'll listen to double of me the whole time. All right. Good evening to everyone. Glad to have you all on board as we continue our journey through the Bible. Today, we're going to jump into some other of the patriarchs. We talked a lot about Abraham last week, got that set up, but the other patriarchs also cover a large portion of the book of Genesis as well. So for review this evening, I found a video that talks specifically about Abraham and some of the episodes that happened for him, some of his story. This video is in a series that talks about the priesthood and how Abraham is one of those kinds of characters. I thought I might be expecting one more person to come in. So come on in and join in the fun. We are just about ready to push play on our review video for today, taking another look at what we talked about last week. So I'm going to push play, and hopefully the sound comes out and goes where it needs to go. So everybody cross your fingers. Go.
We are walking through the story of the Bible, focusing on the role of priests.
And that story begins with God creating a garden called Eden,
where heaven and earth are one.
And God places humans in the garden to be his royal image, his priests, so that humans and God can work together as one. And this whole setup is called God's blessing.
But tragically, the priestly humans are duped into rebelling against God and then exiled from the garden.
But God promises that one day a descendant will come to defeat that evil deceiver and restore humanity as royal priests. And we learn he'll be both a priest and a sacrifice.
But as it stands, humanity is outside of Eden, and things have spiraled into chaotic violence.
But God chooses from the wreckage a couple, Abraham and Sarah. And God calls them to journey to the land of Canaan, and he promises to give them a huge family and all the blessings of Eden.
Now, the blessing isn't just for them. The goal is that God's blessing flows through their family out to all the nations.
And so that makes Abraham's family like a priesthood.
So is Abraham that royal priest we've been hoping for?
Well, no. But Abraham does meet a mysterious figure who reminds us of that promised royal priest.
And who is this?
Well, Abraham is returning victorious from a risky battle, and he passes by the city of Shalem, and this king comes out to meet him. And we're told that this king is also a priest who serves the same God that Abraham does.
Ah, yes, Melchizedek. This man's a mystery. We don't know why he worships Abraham's God. We don't even know his family lineage.
Exactly. But here's what happens. Melchizedek brings this great feast out to Abraham and his army, and then he gives God's blessing to Abraham, saying God is the one who gave him this victory over his enemies. Then Abraham gives Melchizedek 1/10 of everything that he has, and that's the story.
So what is it all about?
Well, Melchizedek is the king and the priest of Shalem, which is an ancient name short for Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, which will later become the capital of Abraham's future family, where the temple is built. And that 10% that Abraham gives Melchizedek, that's just like the 10% Israelites will later give to honor the priests who work in the temple.
Exactly. And so here is Abraham, the father of the Israelites, and he's honoring a royal priesthood that existed long before Israel's temple or their priests.
Ah, Melchizedek.
Yeah, he's super important, and we'll come back to him when we get to the story of David.
Okay, back to Abraham. We find out that he and Sarah are unable to have kids, and they're really old, so how are they going to have a family?
Well, they scheme up their own plan. Sarah forces her Egyptian slave to produce a child with Abraham. But once that happens, Sarah ends up despising her slave and oppressing her.
So instead of trusting God for a family, they do it on their own terms.
Right. And so God eventually does give them their own son, Isaac, but then God promptly asks for the life of that son back.
Abraham is called to offer up Isaac on a mountain as a sacrifice.
And we're told this is a test. God's requiring Abraham to own up to his failures, to stop his scheming, and to surrender his family's future to God.
Abraham and Isaac go up the mountain, build an altar, and right as Abraham is about to offer up his son,
God stops him, and he provides a substitute ram that can be sacrificed in Isaac's place. And here, the narrator stops the story and starts speaking to you, the reader, saying, "This is why we today say, on the mountain of Yahweh, it will be provided."
the mountain of Yahweh, that's Jerusalem.
That's right. And so notice, in both of these stories we've looked at, Abraham is near that high place that will later be called Jerusalem.
In the first story, Abraham meets a royal priest. And in the second story, God provides a substitute sacrifice that covers for the sins of Abraham's family.
Yes, and both of these stories point forward to the need for a future royal priest who will also become a sacrifice for the sins of Abraham and his family.
From here, Abraham's family grows to become an entire people. But they eventually end up as slaves in Egypt. And so, how can a group of slaves produce a royal priest?
Exactly. And so that brings us to Moses, whose story we're going to look at next.
Thoughts, comments, questions? Did you pick up the theme that is being laid down in that video?
You have to trust God.
Yeah, that's a huge theme, not only in here, but through the entire scriptures, yeah. The function, though, of Abraham, and it kind of, the series that this is a part of really spoils that. But for the priesthood, and we're jumping into video number 2. If we were to watch video number 1, we would see how Adam and Eve really were priests in their own way when they were placed in the garden, and so many of the vocabulary words, the descriptive words that are in Genesis 2 and 3 are very priestly words. And so that whole idea is laid down, that because a priest is someone who stands in the gap between God and the people, or in the case of Adam and Eve, between God and all of creation. We need someone to stand in that gap between us and God. And the promise that is laid down in chapter 3 with the seed of the woman who will crush the head of the serpent and the serpent will strike his heel, that's really what we are looking for, someone to serve in that function. And so Abraham is really put forward in so many ways as the father of that line, if that makes sense. And I started talking a lot, so I apologize. But anything else you guys saw, heard, have questions about?
Well, isn't that already mentioning Jesus when you're talking about the heel that will crush the heel of the serpent? That's Jesus.
That's how Jesus saw. That's how Jesus
And that's the whole
put himself forward. That's how Jesus saw himself. And certainly that's how we as Christians today start to see all of those things as they line up. But I try to resist that urge that it's a learned behavior. It really is. And so I'm not putting it down at all. But that learned behavior, that programming that we have to see every part of the Bible, every part of the Old Testament as pointing forward to Jesus. And while it does do that, yes, there's a wealth of understanding and meaning that is there even before Jesus is
Yeah.
brought out on stage, if that makes sense. So you're absolutely right. And I'll stop there.
Did Melchizedek live in a land of Christian followers, of Jewish followers, or was he a lone wolf? Or
He was not a part of Abraham's family,
I know.
and that's as much as we know.
Okay, that's all they tell us about it.
He was the king and priest of Shalem, which would later be known as Jerusalem. But at this point in time, we don't know where he came from, and we don't hear from him again. But that hasn't stopped people from speculating, from using their imagination. And I actually just heard this last week that there's a Jewish line of thought that proposes that Melchizedek was from the line of Shem, who was a son of Noah, one of Shem's sons. And so it actually could be Shem himself, because if you do the math, Shem lived for a long time, and before he died, his age would place him alive during the time of Abraham. It doesn't say that. The Bible is not clear on that, but that is one of the coolest ideas that I've heard in a long time. So I'll just put that on the table for us, but I'll say we don't know. But it doesn't stop us from speculating.
So have they researched this, that they talk about all these time years?
Mm-hmm.
Do they have that figured out to be as the same years as like we have now?
I will say yes, because the revolution of the earth around the sun would not have changed. So yes, a year, as far as I know, is still a 365-day period of time. But whether we can take those numbers to be literal, I think, is the question you're asking.
Yeah, because how would they know? At this point, there was no set 365 days makes a year.
Yeah, they can.
Yeah, I know
Yeah,
they would have seasons, but how would they determine how many days made up a year?
I think that question, while a good question, would not necessarily have mattered to them as far as keeping track of the years. Because if you follow me, you can track 1 year at a time without having to know how many days are in it. You can just say, okay, we've had 4 winters, 5 winters, and that's what you'd count. Does that kind of make sense? We're getting a little bit out into the weeds here at this point, but
Historically, everybody watched the sky at night, and they really did know the bodies. And then the astrology comes in from the idolaters and everything, but the actual study of the planets, they're starting to see certain lights that disappear and then reappear, and like you said, how many winters it goes and everything, and what they use for their timeline. But they started to notice the patterns in the skies,
Yeah.
the night
And
skies.
apparently they documented it.
yeah, they tracked it. They were very interested in the great dance going on up there. And while Genesis chapter 1 attributes that to God's design, being 4 times and seasons, all those heavenly bodies marking the times and the seasons. So, does that kind of...
Yeah.
When did the first calendars really come in then? Was that by the Egyptians or the Assyrians?
Or the Mayans, the Aztecs.
That's another continent.
That is.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure who is contemporaries of who or all that. Interesting question. I don't have an answer for that. Is anybody else? Yeah. But as far as tracking the passage of time, yeah, that would always have had an interest for human beings.
They didn't have the written word yet, probably.
Much less a way of keeping the written word. Yeah. I mean, they had hieroglyphics and carvings, but no, they didn't have 8.5 by 11 reams of paper like we do. Good questions. Anything else? Then, if you would follow me over to our other curriculum for the day. You can minimize that. There's, okay. Pushing play. Dragging this one out of the way. Maximizing that window. And now finally, sharing that screen. And we will not be having any video there. So I'll deselect that. All right. So if you have a book, we're on page 80 and 81. And like I said, we're continuing our journey through the book of Genesis. We covered all the way up to about chapter 27 or so last week with the story of Abraham. And we pick it up this week with a wider shot of the world at this time. So we'll take a look at this one. The ancient Near East. This is a picture of the Fertile Crescent, and it is aptly named. You can see the bodies of water that fed this region, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The region was also called Mesopotamia, a name derived from two Greek words meaning between the rivers. Although Abraham's family roots were in Ur of the Chaldees, way down here, God called him after he settled in Haran, and that was way up here. So if you follow Abraham's journey with the places that are named, he starts down here, but then he moves up here to Haran, still in the Fertile Crescent, still in a very prosperous region of the world at this time. The Patriarchal Narratives speak of Abraham traveling from Haran to Canaan, and from Canaan to Egypt and back. So let's see what we add here. Yep, starts in Ur, goes to Haran, and then goes down to, let's see what else it adds. Goes all the way down to Egypt and back again. So that's a long ways for one family to go. The Genesis narrative refers to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob establishing and reestablishing shrines at Shechem, at Bethel, at Mamre, and Beersheba, these locations right here, all of which happen to be in the eventual promised land itself. The city of Nuzi flourished in the middle centuries of the second millennium BC during excavations in 1925 to 1931. Thousands of stone tablets were found there. Their contents provide insights about the social customs that prevailed during the patriarchal age, which we will look at in a few pages in more detail. The illustration depicts ziggurats near Ur, these large constructions, and Babylon up here. It also contains 28 small symbols to denote the locations of other ziggurats built in the regions. So now we'll add all of those in. You can see all the different locations, these little bitty trapezoids that are littered all over the place. Very important locations. As we zoom in now to the bottom, at the close of the Genesis narrative, Abraham's descendants are happily settled in the region of Goshen in Egypt. This is where we will end up at the end of tonight. Although they have been promised the land of Canaan, they own only two things within its borders, a field and a cave, and those are represented right here. They only own a small portion of the promised land, which Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite. We covered that last week. Genesis describes in unsavory terms the origins of the nations that had lived within and around Israel's borders. These narratives say much to later generations have as little to do as possible to do with those thorns in the flesh. Remember their origins, and we talked briefly about that last time with our family trees. So we will add those names in here. You can kind of see the locations of where they all had their influence. And eventually, when Israel settled in the Promised Land, these nations all were definite thorns in the side for all of them. These 7 nations are ones who the Israelites were told to despise. It's important to note the reference to 7 enemy nations later on in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1, Joshua chapter 3, verse 10, and Ezekiel chapter 25 through 32. The 7 nations that Israel was supposed to shun, supposed to hate. These were most likely them. Even Paul, the Apostle Paul, refers to 7 nations when preaching in Antioch. But there's an interesting story. We will come back again to this much later on, probably in about a year and a half, if we're still here by then. And we have the story of Jesus, feeding the 5,000. And he feeds 5,000 men, not including women and children, and there are 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Do you remember that story? Yeah, very well-known story. That feeding miracle happens right around here. Right up around here. This is Galilee. Shortly after that feeding miracle, in the book of Mark, there's a second feeding miracle that happens across the Sea of Galilee over here. That's the feeding of the 4,000. And again, there's loaves of bread and fish. I think it's 7 loaves of bread and 2 fish, if my memory serves. I could be wrong. But there are not 12 basketfuls of leftovers, but this time there are 7 basketfuls of leftovers. That is interesting, don't you think? Prior to that, Jesus was in Jewish territory here on this side of the Sea of Galilee, and there were 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Most likely a direct reference to the 12 tribes of Israel. But now, when you go outside of Jewish territory over here into Gentile region, there's 7. Could that be for these 7 nations that the people were supposed to hate? This curriculum says yes. I say yes. I will leave that to your imagination. Just hold on to that, because that's kind of the stuff that we'll talk more in detail about. Okay, we've done this, we've done that, we've done that, and we've done that. Any questions on this as kind of a foundation for what we're talking about today? All right, please turn your page. Here we have Genesis chapter 24. It describes Abraham's efforts to ensure that Isaac will have a suitable wife from an acceptable background. The family tree must not be contaminated by marriage to a Canaanite. Hence, Abraham places his servant under oath and sends him to find a bride for Isaac from among pure relatives. Rebekah shows a similar concern when seeking a wife for Jacob. Isaac agrees with her, forbids his son to take a wife from among the Canaanites, and sends him to Mesopotamia to find both a female and a fortune. Jacob returns with 2 wives, 2 concubines, 12 sons, and 1 daughter. So let's see what we do when we zoom in here. Yep. Here's the family tree. It starts with Noah, who has 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And we've already mentioned that the line of Shem is that through which the story follows. We go down to the bottom half here. Here are the names that we talked about last week. Abraham and his story from chapter 12 through chapter 27, I believe. For the rest of our time today, we'll talk about Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And we see all these other names listed there. There's a lot of story that happens with Jacob's 2 wives and their 2 maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. You can see Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and the 1 daughter, Dinah. A come through Leah. We have Gad and Asher come through Leah's maidservant Zilpah. And we have through Rachel, we have Joseph, and finally Benjamin, who Rachel dies giving birth to. And then we had Dan and Naphtali through Rachel's maidservant Bilhah. A lot of names. If you need a reference point, this is a good page to keep your thumb in. And in fact, I think we'll just leave this picture up because that is our last illustration for today. The rest of the material is much like last week. We have just a lot of, we're trying to capture all of this as much as we can, as quickly as we can, as succinctly as we can, with the hope that it piques your curiosity. You know there's more to these stories. You know there is more to be discovered if you've never discovered it before. And it will lead you to open up the Bible after this. So, are you ready?
One of the aides just came in, and I asked her if she had a book for Herb and for me, and she said didn't know anything about it, so she's trying to track them down now.
If she comes in again, you can tell her that they are on the bench outside of the overhang for on assisted living. And in fact, after this, if you've not seen them yet yourself, you can take a peek out on the bench, right outside the entrance to assisted.
In the front there.
Yep, in the front by assisted living.
Okay.
Thank you for inquiring about that. Okay, so we have the great chain of patriarchal stories, starting on page 84. We talked about Abraham last week, chapters 12 through 25, not 27 like I've been saying. We have Isaac's story from chapter 25 through 28. And then the focus shifts over to Jacob for a while. Isaac's death is finally reported in chapter 35. Jacob's story is from chapter 25 through chapter 37. And then Jacob is referred to frequently in the Joseph narrative as well. His last days are reported in chapters 49 and 50. The Joseph narrative is from 37 all the way through the end, through chapter 50.
Esther, she just brought him in, mine in, and she's taken one over to her.
We're on page 84.
Okay.
Excellent. I'm glad those got delivered. Thank you for asking her about those. And I'm pretty sure it's the right one this time.
Yep, it looks like it.
Okay, good. All right. So let's jump in. The Isaac narrative serves as a transition from the Abraham narrative to the Jacob narrative, and that's really very true. The Isaac story doesn't have a lot in it. It has the story of finding a wife for Isaac, and that's Rebekah, who is the daughter of Bethuel, who is the son of Nahor, who was Abraham's brother. So what does that make Rebekah? His second cousin? Something like that. If you can read the family tree better than I can, it's something like that. Genesis 22 describes the very well-known story of the contemplated sacrifice of Isaac, in which Isaac plays a passive role. And that's often been a point of speculation further. That moment in Isaac's life, how traumatic was that moment for him? And if it really, left a mark on him, if it messed him up, if it disturbed him to the point of, kind of destabilizing him, I would not hold that against him. And so maybe that's why Isaac plays such a passive role in the rest of his own story. Genesis 24 describes Abraham getting a wife for Isaac from his extended family, still living back up in Mesopotamia between the two rivers. The narrative describing Abraham's servant persuading Laban to permit his sister Rebekah to marry Isaac is colorful. It involves a well and a meeting by a well. One of the first such meetings where romance happens at a well in the Bible. Rebekah bears Isaac 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. The narrative offers a prophetic hint that Jacob, the younger, will triumph over his older brother Esau. After all, Esau eventually acted very irresponsibly, sold his birthright to Jacob for a crust of bread and a pot of stew. Later, Rebekah manipulates things to ensure that Jacob, not Esau, inherits Isaac's blessing. Interesting note, in Deuteronomy 21, it states that the son who possessed the birthright was to receive a double share of the family inheritance when the head of the house died. Now, I'm still trying to understand the difference between the birthright that was sold to Jacob for the pot of stew and the blessing which was stolen from Esau when Jacob pretended to be Esau by putting on his clothes and bringing in the food when Isaac was old and blind. I'm still not entirely clear on what is the difference between those two. Maybe we'll find out here again. So, okay, here's a question. Why did not Isaac, on discovering Jacob's deception, retract his words to the younger son and set the record straight? Well, it was believed that when a word of blessing or curse was spoken, that word went forth with power to accomplish its message. It could not be recalled or retracted, much like God's words went out into the universe and established themselves. Apparently, that's a similar thing that they believed. Later chapters suggest that Jacob not only regretted his actions in this sordid incident, but reaped the consequences of his deed. So there are consequences to Jacob's actions, his decisions. Jacob becomes the key player in the drama that follows, some of which focuses on the continuing conflict between these two twin brothers. And finally, Genesis 32 and 33 describes the final confrontation between Jacob and Esau that took place years later. The scene ends happily and the brothers are reconciled. So this is called the Isaac narrative. It is the section of time that Isaac lived, and so much of it revolves around Jacob already. We almost kind of skip over Isaac with two very notable exceptions. But now, we turn to the Jacob narrative. Although the Jacob narrative contains disturbing details, and that is very true, modern readers need to note the following. The challenge is to understand Jacob's actions, not to necessarily agree with them. The Bible does not whitewash its characters as other contemporary writings did. If you consider the hieroglyphics on the Egyptian, the walls of Egypt, they only lift up the victories, the shining moments, the parts of the story of their leaders that would support and lend credence to their authority. The Bible doesn't do that. The Bible pulls no punches when it comes to its human characters. It does much, obviously, in establishing God as the true hero of this story. But that does not mean that we are to necessarily emulate everything about these characters. The narratives in Genesis 25, 23, and 27, and 32 and 33 could be classified as conflict stories. They point to ongoing struggles between the Israelites and their Mesopotamian ancestors and between the Israelites and the Edomites. I'd have to look up exactly what those stories are to know what they're talking about, but to do that I guess we have a little bit of time. Do you mind if I just take a peek at what those stories are exactly? And you are welcome to do the same. Conflict stories. Oh yeah, the story of before Jacob and Esau were even born, how they fought in the womb. That's the first one. 23, verse 34.
Now, how did they know they were fighting in the womb?
Oh, they could tell, Doris.
Oh, come
You
on.
saw it going on. All you had to
Come
do
Just look at the sonogram.
They felt the earth rumbling under.
Yeah.
You just had to ask Rebecca. She told you all about it.
Yeah.
23 verse 34. I think that's a misprint because there is no 23 verse 34. 27. Oh, yep, the conflict, the whole story between Jacob stealing Esau's blessing. And then 32, verse 3. And finally, the reconciliation between Jacob and his brother Esau. And it's been established by this point that Esau is the father of many of those other nations who would cause them such trouble later on. Yep, that is this branch right here on the family tree. It doesn't show us anything coming from Esau, but that is where many of those nations came from. All right, Other important details in the Jacob narrative are the following. Genesis 26 tells of the second ancestress, Rebekah, finding herself in a situation similar to that in which her mother-in-law, Sarah, had found herself on 2 previous occasions. Isaac had to pass Rebekah off as his sister instead of his wife, for fear that the beauty of his wife, Rebekah, would cause the competition to kill Isaac. And so he made the same movement that his father Abraham had made. Genesis 26 describes a dispute over a water supply. Genesis 21 speaks of a similar incident in relation to Abraham. The point seems to be that although the chosen people do not own much of the promised land by the close of the Genesis narrative, they do own a tiny portion of it, plus some water rights. Genesis 26 refers to Esau's undesirable marriages to the Hittite women, if my memory serves. In the narrative that follows in Genesis 28, Jacob heads north to the regions from which his grandfather Abraham had come much earlier, and 2 reasons are given for this journey: to escape the anger of his brother Esau and to find a wife who would receive greater parental approval than that given to those Esau had chosen. Again, a disparaging comment about the progeny of Esau that would later become thorns in the sides of the Israelites. During the journey north, Jacob has a remarkable encounter with God at Bethel. In a dream, Jacob sees God speaking to him from the top of a ladder, reaching up into the heavens, reassuring him that the promises made to Abraham will be fulfilled in him. After Jacob arrives at Haran, he establishes a harem of 2 wives and 2 maids and develops a family. It's a wonderful story if you've never read that before. He has difficulties with his father-in-law Laban, decides to flee from Laban and return to the promised land, and is reconciled to his brother Esau. I still remember my children's Bible that I had when I was growing up, and I was reading the story of the patriarchs. That was my favorite moment. That was my favorite part of the story. It was Jacob working for 7 years for his wife, who he believed to be Rachel, but instead was Leah. And he worked another 7 years for Rachel after he realized what had happened. It's just a good story. F. Genesis 34 describes the brutal manner in which Jacob's sons vindicate their sister Dinah's loss of honor. 35 describes Jacob's journey to Mamre, the birth of Benjamin, and the death of Rachel, Jacob's eventual meeting with Isaac, and then Isaac's death. Genesis 36 describes the growth of Esau's clan and their taking control of land to the east of Canaan. And that is what is called Jacob's narrative, Jacob's arc. And while now in Genesis 37, the focus shifts to the next generation down, Jacob is not gone. Jacob is now more of a passive character in this part of the story. But are there any questions or comments to this point as we've been plowing through these stories, these narratives? All right, if you have a question, please let me know, but otherwise we'll continue on. The Joseph narrative. The Joseph cycle begins in 37 and continues in one sweep to the close of Genesis, with one interruption: the references to Judah's marriage to Shua, their 3 sons, Ir, Onan, and Shelah, and the question of responsibility for caring for Tamar, Er's widow. So, although the details of the Joseph narrative are well known, a couple of observations about their style are worthy of note. The Joseph cycle of stories possesses a unified, dramatic quality, and in places is very emotionally stirring. Each step of the plot lays the groundwork for the next event. It tells how a lowly Palestinian shepherd became the second most powerful official in Egypt. The narrative contains numerous events of high drama. It has Joseph in Egypt in the presence of the long not seen brothers searching for food. It has Judah's speech, and finally Joseph's revealing of his identity. I completely agree. These stories have punch. They have power, dramatically speaking. The Joseph cycle contains elements of a wisdom narrative, as it is called. To illustrate, when Joseph first appears on the scene, he is something of a spoiled brat. He finds himself forced to endure a series of difficult events, but grows in stature through the process. These events include resisting the sexual advances of a scheming woman, suffering patiently during an unjust imprisonment, interpreting dreams, exercising sound judgment in high office, and handling the dilemma of determining what to do with possibly unrepentant brothers. When it is all over, Joseph declares, "For God sent me before you to preserve life, and it was not you who sent me here, but God." And again, we plowed through that one. It is highly worth your time. Questions on those two statements about the Joseph narrative? He kind of takes for granted or hopes that you will have heard them before, know them already.
That's just it. We've heard
Yeah,
them all
those are the
these-
stories.
Thank you, yeah.
It's all these other,
Again and again, we've heard them through the years.
Yeah.
But actually, we heard more about those growing up than we did some of the
Mhm.
earlier ones.
Some-
I mean, you hear some of
mean,
these
it's more
highlight ones, like
familiar.
Oh, yeah.
you hear the Jacob Esau story of the
Mm-hmm.
birthright thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I didn't know this part about where it says he sold his birthright to Jacob.
Yep. After Esau had come in from the field and was hungry, was famished, and was near death, according to him, Esau saw that Jacob had a pot of stew right there ready to go. Esau says, "Give me some of that stew or I'm going to die." And Jacob says, "What's it worth to you?" And basically says, "Give me your birthright and we'll call it a deal." And that was highway robbery, but Esau bought it.
Why did they blame Esau for acting irresponsibly there? It seems to me like Jacob is just as guilty as
That's
Esau.
Oh, he is.
right.
He definitely is, yes.
One can do no wrong and the other one to get out of it.
You didn't value it very highly if you.
That is typical sibling stuff. I guess who's telling the story? That's, yeah. Other questions or thoughts?
I always thought it was so sad that Leah just got the short end of the stick everywhere.
She was unloved,
Yeah,
except when it came to having children.
and
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sons and 1 daughter.
but I mean, then the birthright and everything does pass to Rachel's son and not hers.
The covenant promise.
Yeah.
Yes, the covenant promise. Yes, passes to Jacob and continues on through Judah is the one through whom the covenant promise continues on. So actually, that is Leah's.
Okay, and yeah, I
Yep.
have it wrong because I was thinking of Benjamin. for
Right.
some reason.
No, that is Judah.
Okay.
If you're talking about the line through whom Jesus will come,
Okay.
yep, that is the line of Judah. Tribe of Judah. There we are,
Okay.
have it right there. Good question. Other thoughts, comments before we continue on with a few more things here? Page 86. At the heart of these patriarchal narratives is the conviction that God intervenes in human history to accomplish divine purposes. God's hand is detected not only in supernatural appearances, visions, and awe-inspiring wonders, very few of which occur in the Joseph stories, but also in the seemingly detached decisions of humanity. God weaves these decisions neatly into his overall plan for humanity. Through actions which outwardly appear to be evil, God works without show or fanfare, often in ways beyond the ability of the human mind to perceive, to draw good from evil, and to make sense out of the seemingly senseless. The patriarchal narratives show how the promises first made to Abraham were passed on and treasured, and how the chosen people, eventually called out of Egypt and gathered around Mount Sinai, first settled in Egypt. The Genesis narrative closes with a question. What has happened to the promise to Israel that it would be a great people in possession of Canaan? The reader is left with a clear impression that God's work, as great as it has been yet to date, is not yet finished. It leaves us at that point in time.
Question.
Yes.
When the Israelites went into Egypt, it was the brothers and their families because they were starving.
Correct.
That was where the food was.
They were seeking in the midst of the famine.
Yeah.
That's the word I'm looking
And
for.
so they were there how many generations before, and then they came out a great nation, a great number,
Right.
out of Egypt.
400 years, I think.
And also, since they were the ones doing all the slave work, they had muscles, they had strength, they could run faster than their captors. And
Yes. I want to say 400 years they were there.
okay.
Where's that number coming from? I thought I could look in Exodus chapter 1 and find it. I think it's 400 years.
Because, I mean, the Egyptians were getting quite concerned that the slaves were getting so numerous.
They were being fruitful and multiplying.
And what if they rise up against us?
That's exactly right. So they decided to take matters into their own hands. Yep. So yeah, I think that was 400 years. Does that say here?
It seems to me like you already covered the 400 years in an earlier chapter or something.
Yeah, it does. I'm looking ahead on page 91, and according to that, the curtain goes up on a scene several hundred years later than those outlined in the closing chapters of Genesis. So I think it's several hundred years later. Yeah, I didn't see the exact number 400, but 400 is several. It could be. Good question. What else? All right, so now on page 87, we have some socio-political details about the world of the patriarchs, what the backdrop would be for this story. Several centuries ago, scholars began suggesting that the patriarchs never actually existed, but were the imaginative product of later generations seeking to explain their origins and their unique place in the world. This theory gives little credence to the inspiration of Scripture. Furthermore, it surfaced at a time when little was known about the world of the ancient Near East. Archaeological work done during the past century indicates that Genesis does reflect conditions and customs that prevailed in the Mesopotamian world of the patriarchs during the second millennium BC. For example, tablets unearthed at Nuzi reveal much about ancient marriage customs, those things that were just briefly mentioned earlier on, among which a wife who was also a sister, either by blood or adoption, enjoyed a privileged status. Genesis 12, verse 13, and 20, verse 12 are such examples. A wife could give her maid to her husband and then claim the offspring as her own, which happened several times. A contract found at Nuzi obliges a wife to do just that if she herself does not bear children, and adds that the offspring of the slave may not be cast out. Note Abraham's prolonged hesitation when Sarah demands the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. Excuse me. If a maid became pregnant by her master, she was not to claim equality with her mistress, which Sarah was afraid was happening. The offspring of a maid could either inherit some of the family property with the children of the master's wife or be set free. So just those dynamics that we observe in the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael, they are plausible situations that happened in that story. Other documents from the area tell of the sale of a birthright for 3 sheep. We have the sale of a birthright for a pot of soup or a bowl of soup. The possession of the family idols established title to the family inheritance, and the idols were given to the heirs when family property rights were transferred. Genesis 31 ridicules idols and the practice of idolatry. But there is that moment in the Jacob narrative where Jacob is running from Laban after working to have Leah and Rachel as his wives. Rachel is the one who steals the family idols and puts them in her travel bag or saddle bag. So that's just something that popped into my mind. 4. Ancient animal breeders believed that a female's offspring was affected by what the mother animal saw at the time of mating. Genesis 30 describes Jacob making use of this very strategy to procure striped and speckled goats. He took some birch trees and stripped them down and put them around where they were mating. And apparently that worked, according to the Bible's narrative. I know. When people ate as guests in someone's house, the host had to guarantee their safety. This custom still exists in the Middle East today. Yes, I've heard that on many different occasions, that culturally speaking, if you are providing hospitality to a guest, you are responsible for their welfare, for their safety. Because water was often in short supply, nomads insisted that all who had right of access to a well be present when the well was opened to ensure an equitable distribution of its contents. The presence of a few wicked individuals in a community contaminated the entire community. This principle in reverse form is referred to in Genesis 18 with Sodom and Gomorrah. These narratives, the patriarchal narratives, concern themselves not merely with theological speculation, but with the nitty-gritty details of life in the world at the time of the patriarchs. They are anchored in what the world was like at that time. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is found footage, that this is blow by blow what exactly happened in reality, but this is the tradition, the story of the patriarchs. And it is very credible stuff. So, that's the end of Unit 6. Thoughts? Comments?
Those people were messed up.
Yeah.
Who isn't?
It's no wonder the world's like it is.
And they
It just
all
went clear from way back then till now.
Yep. I wonder oftentimes what people 3,000 years from now will say about us.
That's what I
Yeah.
always wondered.
Yep. All right. Any other questions from anyone here at the tables or online?
No questions, but just a comment that you just mentioned tradition. I think that is something that's so very important to our religions, to keep tradition. Because when you screw up the tradition, then you start going down a rabbit hole that you just can't get back from.
Our traditions are really our place to stand. They really are what give foundation to who we are, what we believe, why we do what we do. And yeah, I believe that's what I heard you just say, and I completely agree. Did I get that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So why do they limit the patriarch stories to these 3 narrative, basically, because why did it?
Well, I can find, there was this these, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not understanding your question.
Well,
You have
okay.
Isaac on this row, we have Jacob on this row, we have Joseph on this row.
There were three main.
The
Okay, so
three
it's
main
the
patriarchs.
character-
Yep.
People out of the line.
You're asking why aren't there more stories
Yeah.
than just this?
I mean, why are these,
In this.
why are these the only ones that are important?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. Why are these stories the ones that we have?
Is that like distinguishing between major prophets and minor prophets? I mean, the rest of them are just there, but they're not all that noted.
I'm trying to think of a way to respond to this
They're
question.
probably the most colorful.
These
And,
are interesting, yeah, the most colorful.
colorful and probably relate to more of us.
I think there's definitely a relatability factor involved here. But the other question, we have stories that do not pull any punches when it comes to Jacob. He is portrayed as a scoundrel, as a thief and a trickster. That's what his name means. And I suppose there's a whole arc that Jacob takes. His story takes a definite arc so that he ends up with his name being changed. Yeah, there's a lot of meaning in these stories. And the value really starts to show itself when you've read these more than just once, when you've read them over and over again throughout your whole life. Because for so long, this was the media of the people. This was their TV, their radio, their stories. And so they spent their whole lives with these stories as their narratives. So they got to know them really well, backwards, forwards, upside down, inside out. And with that skill set, you can do some amazing connections, not only here in the book of Genesis, but for the rest of the Bible as well. And that's where the fun really starts. Does that kind of answer your question?
Well,
yeah, I tried.
But you see that, okay, so we get Isaac, and then we get Esau, Jacob, and then we get Joseph, and then we don't hear anything about
And then we jump.
Manasseh and Ephraim.
Okay. Actually, yes. Manasseh and Ephraim are the children of Joseph, the sons of Joseph. And interestingly enough, if you follow the story of the people of Israel, Manasseh and Ephraim are the ones that are mentioned. We don't have a tribe of Joseph. We have Manasseh and Ephraim. When it comes to the land inheritance, yeah, I said we don't have a tribe of Joseph, and I'm not so sure that's accurate anymore as soon as I heard myself say that. But I do know that Manasseh and Ephraim are mentioned in understanding that those two are the tribe of Joseph, if that makes sense. But no, you're right. Once this point in our story comes, we go radio silent for the next several hundred years, and then we pick it up again with the scene having shifted dramatically. So I can only say it's what serves the purposes of the story. Question, Joe.
Based on the times when they had wives and concubines and everything, is there a chance that going back to Rebecca and Laban being brother and sister,
Mm-hmm.
is there a chance that they could have had different mothers? And that, so it wasn't like Leah and Rachel were first cousins exactly to Jacob, but maybe they, had,
Okay.
just wondering if there was ever
Yeah.
any other blood in the family tree
Mhm.
there.
I
Based
am
on-
Everybody
not
else
aware.
did.
Yeah.
There,
Mm-hmm.
handmaids and the laws, like you said, that they said that you couldn't
Mm-hmm.
kick the kids out.
Well, this is before DNA testing
Yeah.
was a thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, try proving who's,
Mhm.
yeah. Okay, interesting question.
I mean, that they really maybe weren't just parent A and parent B, but there could have been C, D, and E in there somewhere.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, and definitely there is possibility for that.
Yeah, because there's one line in here, it says their son Bethel was the father of Rebecca and Laban. It doesn't say anything about the mother.
Right.
And just based on everything that we've been talking about tonight,
Figured
Yep.
more like he did.
it wasn't one woman, one man marriage until death type
Right.
thing.
Obviously not.
And I do know that a lot of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, sort of go back to that why a man could have 4 wives.
Some of them do.
The
Not all of them,
patriarchs,
but some of them do. Yep.
Yeah.
What else? Questions, comments, thoughts? All right, well, next week we jump into arguably the most significant event in the Old Testament. Arguably the most significant event in the Old Testament, with the Exodus event. So let me stop sharing that. Let me say goodbye to our YouTube people. Thank you for joining us.